The Kings and Queens of Scotland. Part 2, The House of Dunkeld, 1034 to 1286. Warning: this episode references, by name, a certain Scottish king, made famous by William Shakespeare. So, if you are superstitious and are currently in a theater, you may want to watch elsewhere. Magnificent and rugged, Scotland has long been a country of fierce independence and brutal power struggles. In the last episode, we met the ancient Alpine warrior kings, who fought off battering waves of Viking raids, and the royal cousins who murdered each other over the throne. In this episode, we'll continue the bitter rivalry between branches of the royal family, learn how the Scots took advantage of the Norman invasion of 1066, meet the nation's most famous saint queen, and find out what really happened to MacBeth. Kenneth I MacAlpin's two sons, Constantine I and Aed, each fathered competing branches of the Alpine dynasty. The throne passed back and forth between the cousins. The death of a king from one branch was often hastened by war or assassination at the hands of an impatient heir from the other branch. This culminated in a three-way civil war between cousins, in which Malcolm II, the Destroyer, came out the ultimate victor. All the while, the kings expanded their borders and fought off Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. The blood-soaked Alpine dynasty came to an end when Malcolm died without a son, but he had been able to kill off most of his cousins and secure the succession of his grandson, Duncan I. He founded the royal house of Dunkeld. You may recall him as the wise and kindly old king who was murdered in the play MacBeth. But the facts were nothing like the fiction. He was a young man in his 20s when he succeeded his grandfather. He had the backing of his mother, Princess Bethoch, and father, Crinan, the lay abbot of Dunkeld. Crinan was a powerful man and was able to use his army to ensure that his son Duncan was crowned in Scone without opposition. Duncan's epithet was the diseased, though it's not clear what malady earned him this name. He was well enough to command an army. He attempted to conquer Northumbria, but failed and barely escaped alive. After licking his wounds, he marched north to Moray. The Duke of Moray was his cousin, MacBeth. He had wed Kenneth II's granddaughter, Gruch, and adopted her son, Lulach, as his own heir. Lulach had a strong claim to the throne and had been the only important male to survive Malcolm II's purge. MacBeth was making waves about his stepson's royal claim, so Duncan decided to put him in his place. The plan did not work out well for Duncan. He was killed in battle at 39, and MacBeth seized the throne. He was known as the Red King. He was tall and had golden red hair. He was the son of Malcolm II's third daughter, Olith, and of Finlay of Moray. During the many dynastic bloodbaths of the reign of Malcolm II, Finlay was murdered by his own nephew, Gilacomgan. He then took over the sub-kingdom of Moray and married Gruch, granddaughter of King Kenneth III. In revenge for his father's death, MacBeth trapped Gilacomgan and 50 other nobles in a hall and burned them all alive. He then married his victim's widow, Gruch, aka Lady MacBeth. The couple had no children of their own, but MacBeth adopted his stepson, Lulach. MacBeth killed Duncan on the battlefield rather than in his bed, as depicted by Shakespeare. And as far as we know, there were no witches involved. But the results were the same. Duncan's two young sons fled for their life, and MacBeth made his way to Scone, where the Scottish lords reluctantly crowned him king. Shakespeare portrays MacBeth as next going on a killing spree to cover up his crimes, and Lady MacBeth, wrapped by guilt for pushing him to it, ending her own life. But in reality, Scotland was peaceful and stable during MacBeth's 17 years on the throne. MacBeth had such a firm hold on the country that he felt comfortable leaving it for a multi-month pilgrimage to Rome. He was the only Scottish monarch to ever meet a pope. But in the end, just like his Shakespearean counterpart, MacBeth came to a bloody end. Duncan's son, Malcolm, killed him in battle. MacBeth's allies prevented Malcolm from making his way to Scone to be crowned. Instead, they supported the succession of MacBeth's stepson, Lulach. Lulach may have conspired with Malcolm in the murder of MacBeth, but Malcolm double-crossed Lulach and murdered him after just 7 months on the throne. Lulach is known to history as the Unfortunate. Malcolm III, the Great Chief, was a child when his father Duncan was killed by MacBeth. He was sent away to safety in Northumbria, while his younger brother Donald was raised in Ireland. The prince married Ingeborg Finnsdotter, widow of the Earl of Orkney. Thus Malcolm got the support of the Vikings to help him clear the throne of MacBeth and Lulach. His reign was peaceful until 1066. That year, King Edward the Confessor of England died without an heir, leaving his throne in contention between numerous claimants. William, the Viking Duke of Normandy, came out victorious after his primary rival, Harold Godwinson, took an arrow in the eye at the Battle of Hastings. The Saxons hastily elected a new king, the last male from Edward's dynasty, Edgar Atheling, who was only 14. But William marched to London and quickly took control. He and his French-speaking Norman knights took over England, married local noblewomen, and erected castles to impose their might on the rebellious Saxon population. Edgar Atheling managed to escape and found shelter with the Vikings. With their support, he launched a major uprising in Yorkshire. William countered with a brutal winter campaign called the Harrying of the North. Edgar ran further north to Scotland. Malcolm offered him protection, but refused to lend him his army for another invasion of England. Petulant, Edgar took his mother and sisters and boarded a ship to Europe, where he hoped to gain military support. But a storm blew them back to Scotland. According to legend, when King Malcolm, now a widower, came to assist the shipwrecked English royals, he fell instantly in love with Edgar's sister, Margaret, and married her on the spot. Margaret of Wessex was 25 and Malcolm 40. She was extremely pious and had wanted to become a nun. Still, the pair had a successful union and seemed to have genuinely cared for each other. While we know almost nothing about the early queens of Scotland, Margaret was an extremely important figure. She spent much of her time praying and reading devotional books. This so impressed her illiterate husband that he had her books decorated with gold and gems. Margaret sophisticated the Scottish court. She imported luxury goods and encouraged the church to conform to Catholic conventions. Her status as a Saxon princess elevated the Dunkeld family in the eyes of Europe and helped to put Scotland on the map. Malcolm and Margaret had 8 children. As his own offspring now had a claim on the English throne, the Scottish king was even more inclined to push the Normans out. He launched raids into northern England, and before long he provoked William to march north ready for battle. With a Norman army staring him down, Malcolm offered to negotiate instead. He gave his eldest son from his first marriage, Duncan, as a hostage to be raised at the English court, and promised to expel his brother-in-law, Edgar Atheling, from Scotland. In exchange, William granted Malcolm estates in England. The peace was brief. While William was distracted by a rebellion led by his eldest son, the King of Scots resumed his raids. The Normans defeated him once more and built Newcastle in Northumbria to better defend against the Scots in the future. William died in 1087, and his son became King William II Rufus. He was even more aggressive than his father and took control of the borderlands. He revoked Malcolm's English estates, and Malcolm countered by sieging Newcastle. Rufus then built a castle at Carlisle. Malcolm attacked again, but his army was ambushed, and he and his second son, Edward, were killed. When Margaret learned of their deaths, she died of shock. Her body was already weakened by years of pregnancy and religious fasting. Malcolm and Margaret were initially buried separately, but in 1250, Margaret was canonized as a saint. That year, both the king and queen were exhumed and placed together in Dunfermline Abbey. In 1560, Mary Queen of Scots had Margaret's head brought to her at Edinburgh Castle, as she believed the holy relic would help her through childbirth. Margaret's skull ended up at the Scots College in France, but was lost during the French Revolution. King Philip II of Spain had the rest of Margaret and Malcolm III's remains taken to Madrid, but where they are today is unknown. Malcolm intended to be succeeded by one of his many sons, but the eldest, Duncan, was still a hostage to the English, and the next, Edward, was dead. Additionally, many Scots resented Margaret and didn't want one of her half-English sons on the throne. They rallied behind Malcolm's brother, Donald III. He besieged Margaret's remaining sons in Edinburgh Castle. Their uncle, Edgar Atheling, helped them escape to England. Donald was called the Fair, possibly because he had blonde hair or because it was already white by the time the 60-year-old was crowned king. He had spent his youth in exile in Ireland after his father's assassination, and likely didn't return to Scotland until his brother's death 50 years later. Still, he represented a return to old-school Scotland. King William Rufus welcomed Malcolm's sons with open arms. He already had their big brother, Duncan, well in his grasp. Rufus supplied Duncan with a large army. He marched to Scotland and forced his uncle to flee to the Highlands. Duncan II. If his half-English, half-brothers who had been raised in Scotland were too English for the Scots, then Duncan, who had spent most of his life at the English court and trained as a Norman knight, was repugnant. Uprisings broke out across the kingdom, and the king was only able to quell them by agreeing to send home the army of Englishmen who had won him the throne. This was a mistake. Without protection, Duncan was quickly assassinated, and Donald III returned to the throne. He didn't like his odds if he had to face down the rest of his nephews, so he made a deal with the next eldest, Edmund. He made him his heir and allowed him to rule the sub-kingdom of Strathclyde. This deal did not go down well with his younger brothers or King William Rufus. He declared that the next brother, Edgar, was truly the rightful king of Scotland, and he backed him up with an army, commanded by his uncle, Edgar Atheling. They captured King Donald and Prince Edmund in battle. Edmund was tonsured, meaning that he was humiliated by having his head shaved, and he was forced to become a monk, making him ineligible for the throne. Donald was held under house arrest for several years, but when he was implemented in a plot against the new king, he was blinded and soon died of his wounds. Edgar the Valiant traveled to England to pay homage to the man who had made him king, William Rufus, and carried the sword of state in a ceremony inaugurating Westminster Hall. In 1100, William Rufus died in a hunting accident, which reeked of foul play perpetrated by his brother. Now King Henry I shored up the alliance with Scotland by marrying Edgar's sister Matilda. The rest of Edgar's reign was uneventful, and he was even called Edgar the Peaceful, not to be confused with the English king of the same name who reigned a century earlier. King Edgar died at 42. He had never bothered to marry and produce an heir. The next to take the throne was fifth brother, Alexander I, the Fierce. Alexander's accession marked the first time in 7 reigns that the throne had passed peacefully. He was a witness to the opening of St. Cuthbert's tomb and was so amazed that the corpse was uncorrupted, he gave gold and silver for the building of a shrine. The king didn't want to honor his brother's will by granting Cumbria to their youngest brother David. David, who had remained in England and become a protege of King Henry I, threatened to march north with the English army. So Alexander had no choice but to cough up all of southern Scotland. Henry further subdued Alexander by compelling him to suppress a rebellion in Wales for him. And he instructed Alexander to marry his own illegitimate daughter, Sibylla. The couple had no children, and she died suddenly at 30. Alexander died shortly after at 36. As he had no heir, the throne went next to youngest brother, David I, the Saint. He was the sixth son of Malcolm III and St. Margaret, when his sister Matilda became Queen of England. He enjoyed a privileged position in Henry I's favor. Matilda secured his marriage to wealthy widow Maud of Senlis. Her lands in Northampton, Huntingdon, and Bedford made David a rich English landowner. David and Maud were happy. He was faithful to her for 17 years, and even after her death, he refused to remarry or take a mistress. When David unexpectedly became King of Scotland, he turned his nose up at their pagan coronation ceremony. He brought an entourage of Norman knights and handed them Scottish lands and titles. Unsurprisingly, this did not endear him to the Scots. A rebellion was led by his brother Alexander's illegitimate son, Malcolm MacAlexander. He allied with Angus of Moray, a grandson of Lulach, whom David's father had murdered. The pair were a thorn in King David's side for a decade, until his friend Henry I of England lent him an army to vanquish them. Henry's only surviving child was a daughter, Matilda. He spent his final years in a PR campaign to get his vassals to swear loyalty to her. But when the king died, his nephew Stephen stole the throne. England was divided between Matilda and Stephen for a 15-year civil war known as the Anarchy. David was Matilda's uncle, so he supported her by causing trouble for Stephen by grabbing up northern territory. He captured several castles, but Stephen rode north and defeated him at the Battle of Standard. Stephen didn't have time to stick around and retake the castles. In his absence, Matilda had taken over London. Stephen raced south but was captured. David went south as well to support his niece, but Stephen got the upper hand again and David fled back to Scotland. For the next decade, David kept out of the anarchy and focused on domestic development. He used what he'd learned in England to restructure Scottish society into a feudal system, which greatly enriched the nobles. The Davidian Revolution saw power centralized in the government and the church. When David was in his 60s, his popular only son, Prince Henry, died of illness. David spent his final years, much like his old friend Henry I, in a PR campaign trying to get his vassals to swear loyalty to his grandson, Malcolm. He was only 11, but at least he was a boy. David died at the impressive age of 70 after 29 years on the throne. Malcolm IV may have suffered from Paget's disease, which causes enlarged and misshapen bones. He was known as Canmore, meaning large head. Malcolm was crowned in Scone 3 days after his grandfather's death. There were several other contenders for the throne. Malcolm's regent managed to defeat 3 challengers. In England, Matilda's son, Henry II, emerged as a charismatic new king, with a powerful wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry took advantage of the Scottish king's youth by calling him to a meeting and informing him that he was taking back the northern territories David I had claimed. Then he required Malcolm to bend the knee and come with him to France on a military campaign. The king was gone for 6 years. When he returned, his people were not happy. In his early 20s, Malcolm's health deteriorated, and he was no longer able to walk. He planned a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain to find a miraculous cure, but this optimistic trip never happened. He died at 24. Malcolm never married or took a mistress, and was known as the Maid. The throne went to his younger brother, William I. He was a strong and vigorous ginger. There is a legend that he got his nickname, the Lion, because he introduced Scotland's royal banner, a red lion on a gold field. But the banner actually dates back to Malcolm III. He was a lion on the battlefield and was determined to retake the lands his brother had lost in Northumbria. It became the obsession of his 49-year reign. William politely asked Henry to return it, but unsurprisingly, this didn't work. Henry was embroiled in a number of conflicts with his rivals in Europe, and later with his own rebellious wife and sons. William joined the fray against Henry. He invaded northern England, but was defeated. The King of Scotland was captured and humiliated by being tied to the back of a horse and pulled to prison. He was forced to agree to a demeaning treaty, which made Scotland a vassal state to England, saw English soldiers garrisoned at Scottish castles, and saddled the Scots with a massive war debt. The Scots were furious and rebelled against their king. Now that Henry had caused sufficient mayhem in Scotland, he focused on fighting the French. He decided to get Scotland on his side by offering King William an English royal bride. Ermengarde du Beaumont was an illegitimate great-granddaughter of Henry I. William considered her below him, but he agreed when Henry offered to pay for an elaborate wedding and throw in Edinburgh Castle as part of her dowry. William was 44 when he finally settled down. He'd had a number of mistresses and illegitimate children. Ermengarde was just 16. She had charm and a quick wit, and William fell in love with her and was faithful to her for the rest of his life. The union improved his standing with his nobles. When Henry II died, his son, Richard I, wanted to raise money to go on crusade, so he sold Scotland's independence back to it. William ingratiated himself to Richard in the hopes of realizing his lifelong ambition to regain Northumbria. He helped to pay Richard's ransom when he was kidnapped on his way home from crusade, and supported him when his brother John tried to take the throne. This backfired when Richard was killed on the battlefield, and John became king. John was bitter towards the King of Scotland and built castles on the northern border. William's soldiers burned them down, and the two armies came to a tense standoff. But William was now in his 60s and ill. He was unable to lead and surrendered his claim to Northumbria. He died at 71, passing the throne to his 16-year-old son, Alexander II. He was crowned just one day after his father's death and was the first son in Scottish history to directly inherit his father's throne. He also inherited his father's aggression, pride, and red hair. King John was unpopular with his own barons and was forced to sign the Magna Carta, the first document which limited royal power. Clause 59 promised that John would return Alexander's 3 sisters who had been taken hostage and give the Scottish king the liberties and rights of the other barons of England. John was furious about the Magna Carta and attacked his own barons. Alexander invaded northern England, and John vowed to hunt the red fox cub from his lairs. He marched his army north to push Alexander back. While he was gone, the barons invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. Alexander swore loyalty to Louis, who promised him Northumbria. But as John was racing south again to save his throne, he contracted dysentery and died. The English barons were happy to support his 9-year-old son, Henry III. They expelled Prince Louis and closed the door on Alexander finally getting Northumbria. He did make peace with Henry and married his half-sister Joan. He was 23 and she was 10. His sisters all married powerful English lords and became countesses. As Joan grew, she never gave birth to any children. Not having an heir was a great concern for Alexander, but he didn't want to annul his marriage and risk his treaty with England. Not fighting with England allowed him to focus on brutally dominating Scotland. He publicly executed several dissenting lords and had 2 burned alive in their own halls. He ordered 80 men to have their hands and feet cut off. Alexander was the first king to have total control over mainland Scotland. Queen Joan died at 27, and Alexander quickly married Marie de Cossey, who gave birth to a son. Alexander turned his attention to the Western Isles, which were still under Norse control. He raised an army and armada and was about to attack when he died of fever at 50. Alexander III was 8 when he came to the throne. His minority was dominated by a bloody dispute between 2 rival regents. Henry III of England took advantage, installed his own regency council, and married the 10-year-old Alexander to his 11-year-old daughter Margaret. But Alexander grew up fast, and at 17 he reclaimed power. He took up his father's final quest and attacked the Norse in the Western Isles. While trying to fight back, King Håkon IV of Norway's ships were hit by bad weather, and he died of fever. His son surrendered, and Scotland took over the Western Isles and enjoyed a period of peace. Alexander and Margaret were happily married. They had 2 sons and a daughter who was wed to Prince Eric of Norway, cementing their peace. England and Scotland maintained close relations thanks to Margaret, but she died at 34. Heartbroken, Alexander did not consider remarrying. That was until tragedy struck. His youngest son, David, died at 9. Next, his daughter Margaret, now Queen of Norway, died while giving birth to a daughter. Finally, his eldest son and heir, Alexander, died at 20. The king had lost his entire family. His only heir was a baby granddaughter, Margaret, who was far away in Norway. The 43-year-old king quickly married 18-year-old French noblewoman, Yolande de Dreux. He was eager to get her pregnant. The king had to attend a council meeting in Edinburgh, and bad weather brewed. His men begged him not to ride home in the storm at night, but he was determined to get back to Yolande. The next morning, King Alexander was found on a beach with his neck broken. His horse had slipped off the edge of a cliff in the dark rain, and he and his mount had fallen to their deaths. There was still hope as Yolande was pregnant, but her baby was stillborn, meaning the only heir to the Scottish throne was 3-year-old Margaret, the Maid of Norway. In the next episode, we'll see Scotland go through its most tumultuous century, beginning with its first tragic queen regnant, through the wars of independence, where we'll learn what Braveheart and Outlaw King got right and wrong about William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, ending up with the accession of the Stuart dynasty, who would rule Scotland for 300 years. All this fascinating Scottish history makes me long to return to the Highlands, and I want you to come with me. I'll be hosting a historic group tour of Scotland from May 15th to 21st, 2024. Over 7 days, we'll experience the highlights of Scottish history, from lowlands to highlands. We'll see the honours of Scotland at Edinburgh Castle, Bronze Age burial chambers at Balnurin of Clava, Eiledonan Castle, the Living History Highlands Folk Museum, Dunkeld Cathedral, the mystical Isle of Skye, and so much more. We'll try delicious Scotch delicacies and unwind over a whiskey tasting. And most amazingly, we'll be doing it all with a group of fellow history lovers and a local guide. Bring a buddy or fly solo. We'll all become friends along the way. Click on the link in the description to reserve your place on this historic trip today. The first 14 to sign up will get $200 off. Only 25% is due at booking, the rest 90 days before we depart. I can't wait to meet you in Scotland. Thank you to Bruce at Scotland History Tours for helping me with the pronunciations in this series. If you want to take more deep dives into Scottish history, check out his excellent channel. A link is in the description. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.